Footage that has been released of the moments after high schooler Karmelo Anthony fatally stabbed Austin Metcalf at a Texas track meet in April of 2025. Take a look.
Not alleged, I did it.
Okay. He put his hands on me. I told him not to. He put his hands on me.
He was sentenced to 35 years in prison, which he's appealing.
The sky over Frisco, Texas, on the morning of April 2, 2025, was heavy with the promise of a deluge. At David Kuykendall Stadium, the air was thick, humid, and vibrating with the nervous energy of high school track athletes warming up for a regional championship. It was supposed to be a day of personal bests, of adrenaline, and of the familiar, competitive camaraderie that defines high school sports. But beneath the gray, weeping clouds, a quiet tension was already beginning to coil in the bleachers. The stadium was packed with students from various schools, a chaotic mosaic of uniforms and team colors. Amidst the crowd, sheltering from the intermittent rain, a tent had been erected for the athletes of Memorial High School. It was a small sanctuary of relative dryness in an otherwise drenched arena. That was where he appeared. Karmelo Anthony, a student from a rival school, stepped into the space that didn't belong to him. He was a presence that didn't fit the geometry of the crowd. According to witnesses, he was asked, once, twice, then again and again, to step out. The requests were simple, standard protocol for the unspoken tribal boundaries of high school athletics. But as the rain began to fall harder, the atmosphere shifted. What started as a mild inconvenience transformed into a stare-down. Witnesses would later recount the chilling words that pierced through the noise of the surrounding meet. "Touch me and see what happens." 17-year-old boy Austin Metcalf stood his ground. He was a linebacker, a teammate, a brother to a twin standing just feet away. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to let the boundaries of his team's space be disrespected. He stepped forward to move the intruder out. It was a shove, a simple physical push intended to clear the tent. In that single fleeting moment, the trajectory of two lives and the lives of everyone they loved shattered completely. There was no hesitation, no second of cooling down. Before the rain could even wash away the tension, a blade appeared, a dark flash in the dim light of the tent, and a single, precise movement was made. The sound of the crowd didn't stop, but for Austin Metcalf, the world did. He collapsed, the color draining from his face as the shock of the injury took hold. The tent, once a place of shelter, became the center of a horrific, life-ending crisis. Before we dive into the dark reality of how this tragedy unfolded and the investigation that followed, if you're a fan of deep-dive storytelling and want to stay updated on cases like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. Let us know what you think about the lines we draw in our own communities. Your support helps us keep uncovering the voices behind the headlines on Crime Secrets Exposed. To understand how the air at a regional track meet could turn lethal in a matter of seconds, you have to look past the violence and into the lives that intersected in that tent. Austin Metcalf was the quintessential hometown kid. To his friends, family, and coaches, he was the heartbeat of the team, a linebacker known for his physical presence on the football field, yes, but more importantly, for the quiet reliability he brought to his inner circle. He was a twin, part of a pair that moved through the hallways of Memorial High with an unspoken protective bond. His life was defined by the structure of practice, the camaraderie of the locker room, and the future-focused ambition of an athlete who understood the value of discipline. He was, by all accounts, a young man who stood up for his own, not out of malice, but out of an ingrained sense of duty to his teammates and his school family. Then there was Karmelo Anthony. Outside of the courtroom documents and the tragic headline that would eventually bind their names together, his life was marked by a different kind of friction. In the weeks leading up to April 2, observers would later point to a series of shifts in his behavior, a restlessness that seemed to seek out conflict rather than avoid it. While Austin was navigating the structured pressure of school sports and looking forward to his upcoming seasons, those close to the periphery of the situation began to notice a pattern of escalating volatility. It wasn't just a singular bad day. It was the appearance of a young man whose personal boundaries were fluid and at times dangerous. There were whispers of run-ins, of a proximity to trouble that didn't seem incidental. In the hyperconnected world of social media, digital trails would later suggest that the path leading to the stadium was paved with grievances, real or perceived. It is the nature of tragedy that the warning signs often seem obvious only in the rearview mirror. Friends would later reflect on the way the tension had been simmering in the community for days, a subtle hardening of attitudes, a feeling that the usual social contract of the school environment was beginning to fray. Yet even with these mounting red flags, the posturing, the bravado, the growing sense of unease, no one expected the leap from high school friction to cold, irreversible violence. There was a disconnect between the reality of these two boys and the catastrophic conclusion that was waiting for them at the stadium. Austin was looking forward to the track meet and the next season of football. He was grounded in the routine of his life. Karmelo, however, was navigating a different internal landscape. When he arrived at the track meet that morning, he wasn't just walking into a sporting event. He was entering a space where his need for dominance and the boundaries of a group he didn't belong to were destined to collide. The stage was set, not by a grand plan, but by the slow, suffocating accumulation of unchecked impulses that would ultimately turn a rainy Saturday morning into a crime scene. The rain continued to lash against the bleachers at Kuykendall Stadium, a rhythmic, unforgiving percussion that seemed to underscore the escalating disaster. Under the shelter of the Memorial High School tent, the atmosphere had thickened from mere annoyance into something far more jagged. Witnesses would later tell the court that the request for the stranger to leave had been issued, not once, not twice, but nearly 15 times. Austin Metcalf, standing amidst his teammates, embodied a resolve that was not born of aggression, but of a quiet, protective instinct for the space his team called home. He was heard telling those around him that he didn't want to fight, that this was a track meet, not an arena for violence. But the boy in the tent, Karmelo Anthony, was not retreating. Instead, he withdrew into a different kind of posturing. With his hands buried deep inside his backpack, his posture shifted. The warning he issued hung in the humid air like a physical threat. Touch me and see what happens. It was a provocation designed to invite the very contact he claimed to fear. When the physical confrontation finally sparked, it was brief, chaotic, and devastatingly lopsided. A shove, meant only to displace an intruder, became the trigger for the hidden weapon Anthony had been shielding. In a single, fluid motion, the bag was breached. A multi-tool with a 3.5-inch blade flashed in the dim light. It was a sneak attack, as prosecutors would later describe it, a strike that bypassed the bravado of the argument and went straight to the heart of the boy who had just minutes before been preparing for a race. The sound of the crowd didn't stop, but for Austin Metcalf, the world did. He stumbled back, his hands reflexively clutching at the wound in his chest. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed. He turned to those around him, the shock of mortality etched into his expression, and gasped the words that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. As the realization ripped through the tent, the scene dissolved into a frantic, blurred nightmare. Coaches and trainers abandoned their duties to sprint toward the sound of screams. In the chaos, Anthony turned and fled, leaving behind a scene of blood, rain, and shattered youth, while Austin collapsed into the arms of his twin brother, his life draining away on the cold, wet concrete of the bleachers. The track meet, once a celebration of physical potential, had been permanently silenced by the cold reality of a weapon that should never have been on school grounds. The immediate aftermath was a blur of frantic intervention and desperate hope. As Austin Metcalf collapsed onto the wet concrete, the atmosphere at Kuykendall Stadium shifted from a routine athletic event to a desperate trauma center. Coaches and bystanders rushed to the tent, their efforts to apply pressure to the wound futile against the severity of the internal damage. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the heavy rain, but the reality was already stark. Austin was transported to a local hospital, fighting a battle that had been decided the moment the blade pierced his chest. Despite the best efforts of medical staff, the damage was too profound, and by the end of that day, the community was forced to confront the impossible: a vibrant life, stolen over a dispute about a tent. While the medical staff fought for Austin's life, the investigation began with a frantic search for the assailant. Karmelo Anthony had not stayed to face the consequences of the carnage he left behind. He had slipped into the chaos of the crowd and vanished. But in an age of surveillance and constant connectivity, the window for anonymity is incredibly narrow. Law enforcement saturated the area, pulling security footage from every angle of the stadium and nearby businesses. The digital trail was just as revealing. Investigators began piecing together the events leading up to the stabbing, uncovering the messages and social media interactions that built the bridge to that moment. Witnesses who had been shaken by the violence came forward, their accounts aligning to form a narrative of a confrontation that had been fueled by a volatile mix of ego and hidden aggression. The police pursuit was methodical and relentless. They tracked Anthony's movements in the hours following the incident, building a timeline that would leave no room for ambiguity. When authorities finally made contact, the bravado that had defined Anthony's behavior at the track meet had vanished, replaced by the stark realization of his situation. He was taken into custody, not as an athlete, but as a suspect in a homicide. The weapon, the multi-tool that had been concealed in his bag, was recovered, a piece of forensic evidence that turned a tragic dispute into a clear-cut case of intentional violence. As the news of his arrest rippled through the school district, it brought no comfort, only a hollow sense of finality to a community left reeling by the brutality of what had occurred in their own backyard. The investigation had moved quickly, but the ripples of this crime were only just beginning to spread. The courtroom in McKinney, Texas, became the final stage for a tragedy that began on that rainy morning at David Kuykendall Stadium. For 8 days in June 2026, a jury of 12 citizens listened to the agonizing, granular reconstruction of what occurred on April 2, 2025. They heard from the students who witnessed the confrontation, from medical experts who detailed the finality of the wound, and from the defense, which painted a picture of a terrified teenager reacting to a sudden, chaotic threat. The trial was a collision of entirely different realities. The prosecution methodically dismantled the claim of self-defense, presenting the incident not as a split-second panic reaction, but as a deliberate escalation. They centered their case on the chilling words that echoed through the stadium tent: "Touch me and see what happens," and the cold, tactical reach into a backpack for a serrated blade. They argued that Austin Metcalf, an unarmed teenager, had been subjected to a surprise attack that left no room for survival. In contrast, the defense team urged the jury to consider the intense pressure of the moment. They argued that Karmelo Anthony, feeling surrounded by bigger, more athletic peers, had acted out of genuine terror. They pushed hard for the jury to consider the legal concept of sudden passion, a classification that would have acknowledged an overwhelming emotional trigger and potentially reduced the sentencing range to a second-degree felony. The jury's deliberation, however, was swift. In just 3 hours, they rejected the self-defense claims and the plea for a lesser charge, returning a unanimous verdict of guilty for murder. The gravity of the room shifted heavily as the sentencing phase began. Karmelo Anthony, now 19, sat in silence as his mother took the stand to offer a final, desperate plea for mercy, speaking of her firstborn son and her belief in his deep remorse. But the jury, tasked with balancing that human plea against the permanent void left in the Metcalf family, returned again after just 2 hours of deliberation. The sentence was 35 years in state prison. As the judge read the term, the courtroom dissolved into raw, audible grief. Newly released body camera footage from the arrest captured a frantic Anthony telling officers, "He put his hand on me, even though I told him not to," followed by the definitive admission, "I'm not alleged, sir, I did it." For the Metcalf family, the verdict brought the cold comfort of legal resolution, though as Austin's mother later stated, no number of years could ever balance the lifetime she had been sentenced to without her son. The finality of the courtroom did little to quiet the reverberations of the tragedy in the streets of Frisco. While the legal machinery had reached its conclusion, the community remained a landscape deeply scarred by the event. The victim impact statements delivered in the final hours of the sentencing phase peeled back the sterile layers of the trial to reveal the raw, unvarnished agony that had been the Metcalf family's reality for over 14 months. For Austin's mother, Megan, the sentence was not a conclusion but a demarcation of her new, hollowed-out existence. She spoke of a home that had gone quiet, of a life now confined to memories and the silence of a gravesite. Her words to the man who had stolen her son, nodding that he was lucky to receive 35 years while she was handed a lifetime sentence without her child, captured the profound, permanent imbalance of the tragedy. Jeff Metcalf, Austin's father, spoke with a rage that had been tempered but not extinguished by the agonizing year of waiting for justice. Having endured harassment and outside narratives that sought to weaponize his son's death, he stood in the courtroom as a man who had been dismantled and rebuilt by grief. He looked directly at Anthony, refusing to let him look away, and firmly dismantled the attempts by outside commentators to frame the murder through the lens of identity or race. To him, the act was never about societal tensions. It was a simple, brutal distortion of right and wrong that had shattered the life of a boy who was, by all accounts, a peacemaker. The impact was felt most acutely by those who walked the hallways of Memorial High. For Hunter, Austin's twin, the graduation ceremony weeks prior had already served as a crushing reminder of the future that was stolen. Accepting a posthumous diploma for his brother was an act of profound, agonizing grace, marked by a long, emotional standing ovation for a boy who should have been standing there to receive it himself. As Karmelo Anthony was transferred to the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to begin his sentence, the town of Frisco was left to navigate the long, uneven process of healing, carrying the weight of a tragedy that had permanently changed their community. The courtroom lights dimmed as the trial reached its conclusion, but for the wider community, the lens through which this tragedy was viewed remained sharply fractured. The case had become a lightning rod for intense discourse, exacerbated by the relentless churn of social media. While the jury had focused on the granular facts of that rainy morning, the sequence of the shove, the warning, and the sudden flash of the blade, the public sphere transformed the incident into a battle of opposing viewpoints. Online, the narrative was quickly polarized. Some segments of the public rallied around Karmelo Anthony, trying to frame the incident through the lens of a defensive reaction by a student who felt outnumbered and confronted by larger peers. This narrative saw the verdict not as justice, but as a systemic failure to recognize fear. Conversely, those who stood in support of the Metcalf family saw the outcome as the only possible moral resolution for a senseless, unprovoked act of violence brought into a peaceful school environment. The trial had forced the town of Frisco into an uncomfortable spotlight. During the proceedings, both the defense and the prosecution had to navigate a landscape where every detail was subject to intense public scrutiny, and where the threat of outside pressure was constant. The courtroom became a battleground of perspectives. The portrayal of a panicked teenager lashing out in a moment of perceived danger versus the depiction of a calculated, lethal response to a minor social confrontation. Even after the gavel fell, the tension did not instantly evaporate. Demonstrations outside the courthouse served as a stark indicator of how deeply the case had touched the nerves of those who viewed the justice system through the prism of their own experiences. The divide was palpable, reflecting a broader societal exhaustion with how conflict is handled and how justice is perceived. Yet, amid the noise of outside commentators and the digital vitriol, the core reality remained stubbornly simple. A young life had been extinguished in a space meant for sport, leaving behind a family, a twin brother, and a community to reconcile an event that defied easy categorization. The trial provided a legal ending, but it left the community grappling with the deep, painful question of whether a verdict can ever truly account for the loss of a future. The gavel has fallen, the cells have locked, and a 35-year sentence has been handed down. But in the quiet aftermath, the tragedy at David Kuykendall Stadium lingers, serving as a chilling testament to how quickly a life can be erased. The trial, with all its legal arguments and public outcry, answered the question of criminal guilt, but it left behind a void that no verdict can ever fill. We are left to grapple with the fragility of our own social boundaries and the devastating weight of a single, irreversible choice. One moment, a teenager was preparing for a track meet, anticipating a future full of promise. The next, he was gone, a casualty of an escalating confrontation on a rainy morning. The case of Austin Metcalf isn't just a story about a crime. It's a mirror held up to the immediate, catastrophic consequences of unchecked volatility. As the community moves forward, the haunting reality remains that a family has been permanently altered, and a seat at the graduation stage was left empty. How do we as a society learn to de-escalate these moments before a single second shatters multiple lives forever? Do you believe the justice system achieved true accountability with this verdict? Or does the loss of a young life defy any resolution a courtroom can offer? If you found this deep dive into the realities behind the headlines compelling, please consider supporting Crime SECRETS Exposed. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you never miss our next case breakdown. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We will be reading.